Science has shown that you have to actually be asleep to truly evaluate the quality of a mattress. Assuming you don't want to spend the night in a mattress store, we've got the next best thing. Bed Match at Mattress Warehouse. Bed Match is our exclusive diagnostic system that recommends the mattresses that are right for you. Say goodbye to mattress shopping guesswork and hello to your best night's sleep ever in your own house. And hello, low prices guaranteed for 1 full year. Mattress Warehouse.
Hi, and welcome back to Amicus. This is Slate's podcast about the law and the courts and the Supreme Court and the rule of law. I am Dahlia Lithwick, and I covered that and other things for Slate. The hits just keep on coming. We're back, and we're bringing you this bonus Opinionpalooza episode right after we brought you one on Wednesday night. And we're doing that thanks to the support of our Slate Plus subscribers who've made it possible to share this episode not only with you, but with all of our listeners, whether they are subscribers or not. So thank you, Slate Plusers. We so appreciate you. If you are not a Slate Plus member, but you'd like access to our bonus episodes and to never hit a paywall at slate.com, you can join our membership program at slate.com/amicus plus. Or if you're listening in Apple Podcasts, hit try free at the top of our show page. Now, if you, like me, were hoping that the U.S. Supreme Court would finish up the term on Friday morning and give us some semblance of our lives back, nope. The court has just let us know that there will be decisions next Monday, at least, maybe more. And yeah, one of those decisions may well be the Trump immunity case that the court has now successfully delayed since, checks notes, December. But while all eyes are on the immunity decision and on the EMTALA decision that was accidentally released on Wednesday on the SCOTUS website before it was being taken down and then intentionally released on the SCOTUS website on Thursday, Thursday morning also saw some big blows to what's known as the administrative state in a pair of cases that are probably not going to make national headlines before Thursday's debate. But they really should. In Ohio versus EPA, the Supreme Court struck a blow against the EPA's good neighbor rule that tries to deal with ozone air pollution on 5 to 4 lines. And then in SEC versus Jarkesy, again, along ideological lines, the court made it exponentially more difficult for the Securities and Exchange Commission to bring an enforcement action in a case that is going to affect how many other agencies operate as well. Please, dear listener, do not glaze over because making it impossible for government to govern feels boring to you or because hamstringing environmental protection seems kind of distant and regulatory to you. This is the stuff of Project 2025. It is the stuff of Leonard Leo, and it is urgent. And that's why Lisa Heinzerling, the Justice William J. Brennan Jr. Professor of Law at the Georgetown University Law Center, is here to help us unpack what is happening to the administrative state even before those big Chevron cases come down. Lisa is a former senior Obama EPA official, and her primary specialties are environmental and administrative law. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you for having me.
And we're joined, of course, by Slate's own Mark Joseph Stern, who covers the courts and the law. And together we're going to think through Jarkesy, the EPA, EMTALA, the looming demise of the Chevron doctrine. So good times, Mark. Welcome.
Oh, so happy to be here, Dahlia.
You sound it. So, Lisa, I want to start with you. I want to flag a piece that you wrote in the fall of 2022 called How Government Ends. And you make the point in this piece that Steve Bannon promised with the Trump administration, the first 2016 Trump administration, that the administration would fight every day for the, quote, deconstruction of the administrative state. And I think you said in the piece, probably people didn't even know what that meant. Can you just walk us through, if you would, the sort of ABC agencies, the 400 or so departments and offices, the 3.5 million civilian and military employees, and the $1 trillion budget that these agencies constitute, and why this all matters to people who kind of inhaled the Schoolhouse Rock 3 branches of government theory of governance?
Yes. So the administrative agencies basically do the daily work of government. They are given almost every time Congress passes a statute, it runs that statute through an administrative agency. It gives the daily work of that law to an agency. So just about anything you care about or even any activity you engage in is at some level touched by an administrative agency. If you breathe the air, if you take medicine, if you drive a car, if you have an investment account, if you have a retirement account, if you have a job, all of these activities are to some extent governed by administrative agencies. And so when Steve Bannon promised to deconstruct the administrative state, he really should have said he was on a mission to deconstruct government as we know it.
And just as a follow-up, I think that one not necessarily visible through line through so many of the cases that were heard this term are because they all get sort of chunked out as, this is an abortion case and this is a tax case. They get chunked out as separate and apart from this very, very ambitious, I want to say it's part of the Project 2025 effort, as you say, to dismantle government. And so even though, Thursday brought, a blow to the EPA and the SEC, which we're going to talk about, this court has also heard about the CFPB, the FDA, the FTC. All of these entities in some way or another get kind of brought into the equation. And I would love for you to give me, I know you've given me the truncated version, your best argument for why the whole kind of mess of I'm here from the government and I'm here to help, why that is all on the line and your best analysis for why people should care.
Well, I think they should care because partly I'm not sure that they notice this. It happens so naturally at this point. It happens so regularly that they may think they get outraged if their drinking water is contaminated with lead, if their medicines aren't safe and effective, if they somebody actually takes all the money out of their investment accounts. Those things don't make people happy. And yet those are all activities and sort of rights protected by administrative agencies. And so when the Supreme Court starts to take apart these agencies, to dismantle really important features of them, then it matters because it's destabilizing a really important part of government.
Can I just spell out something I think is implicit in what Lisa just said, which is that the Supreme Court targets the functioning of these agencies because it understands that most Americans won't realize what it's doing and what the impact is. I think if the court struck down some law that said if you're defrauded, then you get compensation, that would provoke mass outrage. But if the court hobbles federal agencies' ability to police against fraud, nobody knows, except for people who listen to Amicus and JD's, nobody understands that they have effectively sort of ground the wheels of justice to a halt and prevented any kind of redress for victims. And that's what's so insidious to me about the cases that we'll be talking about today and so many of these other cases, is that it's all kind of disguised in legalese that's very difficult for normal people to grok. And it's all too easy to turn your head and say, well, this isn't about guns or abortion, so I'm not going to pay attention. This may well implicate your rights as an individual, your ability to get some kind of justice when you are wronged. But because SCOTUS is going at the alphabet soup of agencies rather than going straight to the source of power, striking down some law, it's just hard to sort of connect the dots here, I think, for a lot of folks.
I think that's really an important point. And I'd just make one additional point in that regard, which is to say the court usually talks in terms of not liking the power of agencies, not liking the power of unelected bureaucrats, right? And so it acts as though those folks who are unpopular in some circles are the ones that are its target. Its real big target is Congress. What it's doing in all of these cases is limiting the power of Congress to take on important problems. And they say at the end of their opinions all the time, well, Congress can pass a new law. Well, in the cases decided on Thursday, Congress had passed laws. And in one case, a very recent law, the Dodd-Frank statute. And the Supreme Court almost kind of makes fun of how young it is and makes it seem like that statute is worthless because of its young age. But
barely a decade old.
Barely
right?
a decade old, exactly.
After years of saying, well, Congress can just pass a new law. Congress passed a new law. Oh, we don't care about that. It's so new. Why should we give any kind of legitimacy to that law? It hasn't even had its bar mitzvah yet.
And maybe one other obvious flip of that is not only is it hobbling Congress, and as you've argued elsewhere, Lisa, it's hobbling agencies who are trying to come up with creative solutions in real time to real problems. It's also arrogating more and more power to the court. And so it's that kind of trifecta that's so frightening. Would you be so kind as to walk us through the Good Neighbor case that was decided on Thursday? Just help us understand what the issue was.
Yes. So the Clean Air Act sets air quality standards that apply across the country. These apply to highly dangerous, even deadly air pollutants. And it tries to set them at a level that will protect the public health. And the states are supposed to take the lead in implementing those standards. But that power of the states comes with a limit, which is if states are contributing air pollution that prevents other states, downwind states, from meeting their air quality standards, then the EPA can step in if the state doesn't propose measures that would take care of that problem. So this case is all about interstate air pollution. It's basically about states offloading pollution onto other states. It's a fight among states, not states against the federal government in some sense. And so the EPA has for a long time issued rules that both disapprove these state plans that are supposed to implement the air quality standards, and then the EPA will issue its own federal plan. Lots of acronyms in the Clean Air Act. This is Federal Implementation Plan, or FIP. So it issues its own plan for dealing with that pollution. And it's done this many times, and not long ago, maybe 10 years ago or so, the Supreme Court upheld the predecessor of the plan that was at issue in Thursday's case. The judgments are highly technical and based on EPA's sense of how much should it require every state to clean up its air in order to make sure that downwind states aren't bearing the brunt of more pollution than they should. So they issued a plan like that. And the case is about that plan, the so-called Good Neighbor Plan, named for obvious reasons. And the court invalidated, or at least temporarily stopped, the implementation of that plan because it said that the agency hadn't explained itself well enough in issuing it.
And can you help us think through what it is? I mean, we've now talked about the various tricks that the court has deployed over the years to stymie agencies, but what is the kind of gravamen of Justice Gorsuch's majority opinion?
He says that the agency should have understood that some courts would reject the EPA's disapproval of those state plans. And therefore, that would mean that the federal plan would have fewer states in it than the agency started out with. And there's a lot wrong with what the court did here. Among things, it's not clear that the challengers to the EPA's rule ever really clearly raised this argument. And indeed, it's telling that the Supreme Court itself is the one who actually formulated the question it wanted the parties to address. So they formulated the question for parties who had not really raised it clearly below. And so what the court's decision does, just to make it very clear, is it makes it harder for an agency like the EPA, dealing in very technical statutes with a great deal of evidence and 1,000 pages of responses to public comments, makes it very difficult for that agency to run the gauntlet of court review. Because the court can just say, you know, this one thing you didn't say, we don't think you said it quite clearly enough. We know what you're going to do, what you've already explained to us in a separate filing, why you did that. But you need to go back and explain it all again. You need to start over and explain yourself all over again. That is a tall order.
Can I just make 2 points about this majority opinion? I mean, first, Lisa, I totally agree. It's a hyper heightened form of scrutiny that Gorsuch applies here. It's like beyond strict scrutiny. He's essentially saying that the EPA should have been able to look into a crystal ball, seen the future, predicted that certain federal plans would be halted in certain states, and then accounted for that preemptively before it actually happened. Am I reading that right?
Exactly. Yes. And they should have foreseen, basically, because so much is made of these stays. But those are stays issued by courts that I believe do not have jurisdiction, certainly over the rule itself, right? So the venue is supposed to be in the D.C. Circuit. And so the question is, in exclusively in the D.C. Circuit, if there is a national plan. Right. And so it strikes me that some of these courts, and some of them are already saying this, that they don't actually have, certainly they don't have jurisdiction over the federal plan.
So Gorsuch is rewarding these courts for breaking the rules and seizing these cases when they didn't have venue. He's also just blazing past the fact that the Clean Air Act itself imposes a harmless error review, right, in the courts, which Justice Barrett, which we'll talk about in a second, she makes a lot of hay of this, I think rightly so. Gorsuch is imposing super strict scrutiny. The Clean Air Act says that the correct standard here is harmless error review. And so it seems as if you could not butcher the actual text of the law. Like, I know this is really technical. We're talking about ozone pollution. We're talking about upwind pollution traveling downwind. But if you just pull out the statute that these guys are purporting to interpret, like, I see this much less as Neil Gorsuch doing his textualist, this is what the law says, and much more of Neil Gorsuch, frankly, having mommy issues. Remember, his mother was the administrator of the EPA, held in contempt by Congress for alleged misconduct. One of the cases that became the Chevron decision was involving Ann Gorsuch, and he seems to have like a vendetta against this entire agency and everything it ever does because he's still pissed at what happened to his mom. Is that like too Freudian?
I can't really speak to that.
I was just going to say, I'm not going to answer that. Lisa, if you want to take a whack at Freud, you certainly can. Time to pause and hear from some of our sponsors.
New from the Embedded podcast. What happens when 3 Republican women challenge their own party?
Maybe we need to speak out a little bit bolder. Maybe we need to do something to get people's attention.
They have a front row seat to democracy. Now, you do too. Listen to Supermajority from NPR's Embedded and WPLN.
This is Dahlia Lithwick from Amicus, just pointing out, in case you didn't know, how much legal news is coming at us right now, whether it's Donald Trump or Hunter Biden or the full-scale Opinionpalooza that is the end of the term at the U.S. Supreme Court. Here at Slate, Amicus and What Next have got you covered. What Next is Slate's daily news show featuring breaking news analysis with experts and with the people who are living the headlines. The consequences of decisions made in a hushed courtroom at 1 First Street in Washington, D.C. will reverberate all around America. And What Next is going right to those who are most affected, from a grieving mother fighting to settle with Purdue despite her son's death, to an Idaho physician taking care of women who need life-saving abortion care. What Next is asking, how will these rulings change lives, and whose lives are they going to change? If you haven't heard one of Mary Harris's spectacular interviews, her style is warm and incisive, curious and open-minded. Get ready to hear some stories you have not heard before, or to hear a different side of a story you thought you already understood completely. So we've got you covered with Amicus's Opinionpalooza coverage and What Next's news coverage. You will have the context you need this June. On Amicus, we're going deep on the cases that are changing American lives. And on What Next, Mary Harris cuts through the noise so that together we can all figure out what's next. Follow What Next now and listen wherever you get your podcasts. I do think Mark raises this issue, which is this is a 5-4 boys versus girls split. And it seems to suggest, as so many of the decisions we're going to talk about EMTALA in a minute suggest, which is that Barrett is still somewhat of a mystery. Can you talk us through, for one quick minute, the substance of Justice Barrett's decision to sort of throw in with the liberal wing on the court? And I'm just going to flag for people, because now Freud has entered the room on Mark's shoulders, but I just want to note that in the EMTALA decision, we do have Justice Alito kind of quietly accusing Justice Barrett of tiptoeing away from deciding that case on the merits because she's too, quote, emotional. So maybe this is an emotion problem. I don't know. But why do we have this new improved Justice Barrett who throws in her lot with the 3 other women on the court?
I think it's interesting. I think Justice Barrett is still evolving as a justice, for sure. I also think it's significant. We haven't talked about one part of the opinion that's really important, which is the court, as you know, has been using its emergency docket. Some people call it the shadow docket, this docket that's supposed to be for time-sensitive cases, right? That everything has to stop in that case. Otherwise, something terrible will happen. And this case came up on that portion of its docket. And what the court did is it embraced a view that Justice Kavanaugh has embraced as to what the standard of review is. And Thursday, it said, look, we know we're supposed to look at whether anybody's hurt by this, but it's all a wash. And the significant thing is, well, not really. What we have on one side are human life and health, right? And environmental effects, but human life and health. On the other hand, we have an abstraction like state sovereignty. It doesn't take a gender theorist to see that it's at least interesting that 4 women put their money on life and health, right? And that the men chose an abstraction over that and said it's a wash. And therefore, we'll move on to the merits. And what that does is, one, it just wipes out the special credence courts gave for a long time to environmental problems and to environmental threats. And secondly, it makes it very easy for the court to use its shadow docket for ordinary administrative law cases. If it just thinks, it eyeballs a case and it says, I think there's something wrong with what the agency did. And you know what? I'm going to write the question for these people. Right? And then I'm going to actually issue a decision that really sort of overstates whether they made that argument even before the agency. That's a very dangerous thing for administrative agencies if this becomes the regular way of doing business in the Supreme Court.
So I strongly agree. I would love to stay on the couch with Freud, but I'll just step off and walk briefly into the classroom, which is where I think Barrett's mind frequently is. You know, she was a law professor for years, then briefly had a stint on the appeals court, and then she became a justice. Kind of a whirlwind tale that brought her from a somewhat lowly position in academia to the height of power. And I still feel like she's sometimes adjusting to that change. And it comes through in some of her opinions where it feels like in writing a dissent, she's grading the work of the majority and treating it like it's the work of a bad student who didn't really read or understand the assignments. Right off the bat, she says, I will start by setting the record straight with respect to some important background, period, new paragraph. Like that, you can imagine her scrawling that in a red pen on like a bad paper that completely misunderstands the case. And I do feel like she's saying, Gorsuch comes up short in every respect. Her dissent is really long. It's quite thorough. It's quite technical. She didn't have to do that, even if she weren't throwing in her lot with the other conservatives. You know, she could have done a kind of broad, like, this is an emergency case. We were too nitpicky, the end. Instead, she goes through point by point to say why Gorsuch is so wrong on every account. And it does really read to me a lot like when she's grading, say, the Fifth Circuit's work in a decision like Murphy from Wednesday, where she is pointing out all the flaws, all the errors, all the leaps of logic that can't withstand 2 moments of consideration and saying, this would not fly in my classroom. And so it certainly should not fly at the United States Supreme Court.
Mark, you're making such an interesting point about, if you think about the sort of Piaget's developmental steps of, movement conservatives, I think, we can safely say at the end of this term that Justice Amy Coney Barrett is fully at the lie to me better stage. And, if you're going to misrepresent, then do a good job of not embarrassing yourself. And I think this feels a little bit like that. I want to talk about Jarkesy because I think it is on stilts, this phenomenon we've been describing, which is how do you kneecap the administrative state without saying you're doing it and without the public realizing you're doing it. So, Mark, maybe we talked about this on a show when the case was argued, but can you just remind us who investment advisor George Jarkesy Jr. is and why his case comes to the court this term, tricked out in the, labels of freedom and get your government paws off my life?
Yeah, so Jarkesy is a right-wing talk radio host who created two hedge funds that managed about $24 million in assets from, frankly, unsuspecting marks. He and his firm lied to their 120 investors about where their money was going and dramatically overvalued holdings to justify management fees that were basically extortionist. So the SEC, as is its mandate from Congress, launched an administrative proceeding adjudicated before an administrative law judge at the agency, and the agency prevailed, and it fined Jarkesy $300,000, barred him from participating in the securities industry, and ordered him to give up about $685,000 in unlawful gains. This was business as usual at the SEC, and Jarkesy had a lot of protections here. The administrative law judge has protections to guarantee independence from political pressure. He had the rights to appeal the decision against him for review in the federal judiciary. He decided that none of that was enough. He argued that he had a right under the 7th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution to scrap all of that and to have this entire case adjudicated in federal court before a jury. The Fifth Circuit ruled in his favor on that front and several others that we'll talk about, but that ended up not really mattering. And it went to the Supreme Court as, I think, kind of like a missile at the heart of the administrative state. And I feel like that missile hit its target.
Yeah, Lisa, before we talk about what the court did decide, this really comes, and I now want to put the Fifth Circuit in some kind of scare quotes or have some emoji, but this does come up from the Fifth Circuit, which just turned this case into a kind of chocolate fountain of deregulatory, all the deregulatory things. So before we talk about what the court did decide on, can we just talk about what actually didn't happen today? The court, if they wanted to go big, the Fifth Circuit certainly said, all the chocolate is yours. They didn't go as big as the Fifth Circuit would have asked.
Right. So they did not address the question whether the job protections that are given to administrative law judges are too much, whether the president basically should have a bigger hand in being able to remove agency officials, or some politically appointed person should have a bigger hand in that. And just notice how strange that argument is. For a long time in this country, a big debate was whether administrative law judges were too close to politics. And so we gave them more job protections. And that was the worry under the Constitution. But now everybody's trying to make them less protected, closer to the political apparatus, which just feels like a very strange turnabout. So there's that argument about removal protections. Then there was another argument that the statute that gives the SEC the power to choose whether to go to its in-house adjudicators or to the federal courts, that doesn't give adequate guidelines for that choice and therefore violates something known as the non-delegation doctrine, which is like Congress can't give too much of its legislative power to agencies. And that doctrine hasn't been used by the Supreme Court to overrule a federal statute since 1935. And only in that year did they do that. So the Fifth Circuit really, like you say, really, swung for the fences and decided all three of those issues. Let me just mention one wrinkle on that point that I think is troubling. It's true the Supreme Court didn't decide all of those, and that would have only added to the sort of momentousness of its opinion. But notice what it does is it leaves in place the Fifth Circuit has told us what it thinks about the power of the SEC in these regards. It's not going to change that view.
And do you want to give us 1 minute on what the court does decide today? Because it's going to have just vast ripple effects into other agencies. And Justice Sotomayor, who I should note, read her dissent from the bench on Thursday, calls this a power grab, sort of really throws up a flare that this is a huge separation of powers problem that has got to be called out as such.
Yes, the court held that actually Congress cannot give the agency the power to adjudicate actions for civil penalties under the Securities Acts for fraud. They can't give that power to them. They need to go to federal court, and when they go to federal court, they need to go before a jury. And so there's a weird kind of backward way in which they work. In other words, they say this is a jury trial, right? The implication of it is they actually can't stay in-house, right? There are no juries at the federal agencies. So they need to go to federal court and they need to go through a jury, which completely upends the process that Congress chose. And as Sotomayor points out in her dissent, there are 200 laws that have similar structures. There are 24 agencies at least that have the power to do what the SEC did here. And so they've left us in a mess.
And Congress gave the SEC this power in Dodd-Frank after the Great Recession because the previous system wasn't working to Congress's satisfaction, right? When you have to go to federal court and adjudicate every single civil penalty before a jury, that takes way more time and resources and personnel than doing it before an administrative law judge. It requires, I think, personnel and resources that these agencies just don't have, and that the Justice Department doesn't have to lend an agency for however many years it might take to try one of these cases, right? So it feels to me like another value judgment against Dodd-Frank. How many strikes has the court had against Dodd-Frank at this point? This is just another hole that the court blows in it, like, oh, Congress, you thought that you could protect us from another recession? Well, we know better than you.
The Supreme Court's always saying, go get a new statute. Well, this is a new statute, right? It's enacted, as you say, after a significant national crisis. I would also point out the Affordable Care Act has been up and back to the Supreme Court many, many times and been questioned and come within an inch of its life of invalidation. And so it just isn't credible anymore for the court to think that what it really wants is for Congress to act. It wants it to act if it acts the way the court wants it to.
And we should point out, this is an ahistorical decision, right? I think Justice Sotomayor makes this point really well. The majority kind of slices and dices little quotes from a history that say jury trials are great. And I think we all agree that jury trials are great. But the Seventh Amendment does not mandate a jury trial in every single civil dispute. And the Supreme Court has long recognized that when the United States acting as a sovereign wants to vindicate its interests, say against securities fraud, that it gets to create an alternate process for doing so that isn't subject to the Seventh Amendment's requirements. And Congress built up so much of the modern administrative state based on that promise from the Supreme Court. Like, the Supreme Court green-lighted this system of what the majority calls in-house adjudication, of not having to take every single civil enforcement action through the federal judiciary in the 1970s. And since then, Congress has created a bunch more agencies. It's given this power to more agencies. It has built up a lot of protections for citizens, for consumers, for workers, for whatever, on the grounds that the Supreme Court has said it's okay. And now the Supreme Court just comes in and smashes the Jenga tower. It doesn't even take one block out to see if it topples over. It's just like gone. And that too feels like a major separation of powers issue, because it really does, to mix metaphors, like totally pull out the rug from under not only Congress, but also the executive branch, which had reached this agreement about how best to protect the public and to vindicate the United States' interests. And then the Supreme Court just says, no, we don't like that anymore. So we're going to take that precedent away from you.
I like the metaphor of pulling out the rug from under the Jenga tower. It actually gets you exactly where you need to go. Lisa, you were just going to say?
Well, I think it's even compounded. That problem is compounded by the court's refusal to note that it's changing things a lot. And so it acts as though this is just in line with all precedent and there's nothing new here and it's just this one little case out of Texas and it's just this one new law. But its principle goes much farther than that, and it would be just more honest and satisfying if the court acknowledged the damage it was doing.
We're going to take a quick break right here. We'll be back shortly. So, Lisa, I'm going to ask you actually to do exactly what you did at the very top of the show, which is put meat on the bones for people who are struggling to understand an abstraction like the SEC and an abstraction like what has changed. As you say, this is a major change. Can you talk about what other agencies are affected, how they're affected, what it's going to cost, where all of those costs are going to be filled? Like, this is a massive shift in how agencies do business. And as you note, that doesn't seem super visible to the majority.
Yeah, I think there's a list of the statutes and the agencies, but they're everything from EPA to the Food and Drug Administration to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. On down the line, they all have this structure. Congress began using the structure that allows in-house adjudication of enforcement actions and even allows imposing penalties through that structure. And so in any case involving an agency with that in-house ability and civil penalties, we will hear complaints and probably lawsuits against the agencies. And so the scope of this is almost as big as the scope of the administrative state I talked about before. I mean, it doesn't reach everything. It's not every single agency, but it's a whole lot of them. And it's aiming at agencies that have civil enforcement penalties because people violate the law. And when they do, people are hurt, right? And so those are the very agencies who will be affected by this ruling.
And there are already these challenges bubbling up in the lower courts, right? The Fifth Circuit has declared itself to be a clearinghouse for them, but even in other circuits too, we've got challenges based on the Seventh Amendment to the FDIC, the NLRB, the FTC, the FCC, the Department of Labor. Like, if you don't know what those letters mean, I encourage you to learn, because there's a good chance that they're protecting your rights at this moment, and they may soon be deprived of the opportunity to do so. Because, I mean, check me if I'm wrong, Lisa, but it just seems to me wildly unlikely that Congress is going to give both these agencies and the Justice Department the massive infusion of money and personnel that it's going to need to try all these cases. It seems to me that, you know, if every single time you want to bring a meaningful civil enforcement, you have to call DOJ and ask how many of your lawyers are ready to try this case for the next 3 years, you're just going to drop these actions, and it's going to have not only a direct impact on some of the cases that are already going through the agencies, but a chilling effect on the agency's ability and willingness to bring new enforcement against wrongdoers.
Absolutely. And at some point, you know, the chaos is the point, I think, really. One way to deconstruct the administrative state is to make it just impossible for it to function. Not only take away some structures, break some structures, but then inject so much legal uncertainty into the system that an agency can't rest on what it's always done or the statutes that have been upheld. It needs to constantly worry about whether a court is going to find its whole structure unconstitutional.
And just on that same point, Lisa, you know, I've read you talking about the major questions doctrine. We talked today about the non-delegation doctrine. We could talk about Chevron. Maybe we'll talk about it on Friday, maybe on Monday, maybe on August when the term actually ends. But how does all of this fit together? These, you know, some of these are really fringe theories. And there's a sense in which I think there's some public attention this year turned to Chevron, and to which the three of us would say, yay, Chevron matters to the American public. But Chevron is just a tiny piece of the pie, the deregulatory pie. And so I would love for you to just help us understand how this fits in with what's coming in the Chevron decision, but also what is coming in, you know, Project 2025 and these larger efforts to say, no matter what you think you've got a handle on, there's so much more out there.
Yes. I mean, the Supreme Court is taking on the way that we appoint personnel, the way we remove agency personnel, the way that statutes should be interpreted. Thursday, it took on the requirement that agencies explain themselves and really beefed that up. So that in all these ways, it's just making agencies work harder. And so it doesn't take a genius really to connect the dots. And I see two ways of connecting them. One is this is a highly anti-regulatory court. And indeed, it's veering into the anti-government court, right? It just breaking stuff, long-standing structures, long-standing understandings about what the law allows. And so there's that. This fits perfectly with that agenda. The other thing is, and I'll say it, there's a real fondness for billionaires. Billionaires are the actual real parties in interest in a lot of the cases in front of the Supreme Court now. We know that the justices enjoy the company of billionaires. And who is benefited when civil penalties are made harder to impose? I think it's the people who have the power to hurt a lot of people at once.
And I think that brings us to the painful irony of the fact that the Supreme Court is pretending to be this great guardian of civil jury trials at the same time that it allows corporations and employers to shunt every single lawsuit and class action into mandatory individual arbitration before its hand-chosen arbitrator in some Delaware backwater, right? This is the same court that has turbocharged the Federal Arbitration Act to destroy any right that previously existed to access a trial by jury for employees who are wronged by their bosses, for consumers who are wronged by giant corporations. The Supreme Court consistently takes the side of the corporations and the employers and the bad guys, right? Doesn't even pretend that these bad guys aren't bad, just says you can shield yourself from going to court by simply forcing everybody to face these extremely unfair arbitration proceedings. And then when the billionaires themselves come to court and say, but we want a jury trial, the Supreme Court says, but of course, the Seventh Amendment protects your right to a jury trial. You guys are special. You're favored in this court. You aren't like those pesky consumers and employees and working people who we're happy to force into arbitration and slam the courthouse doors on. You get our most special treatment. You're beyond economy plus. You're first class, baby. And I cannot handle the rhetoric that the chief uses in Jarkesy to applaud his own decision, right? And say, oh, we're such great guardians of liberty, when every single day people who are trying to get a jury trial are being forced out of the courthouse because of this same majority's own terrible rulings.
Just brief public service announcement. For those of you who would like to buy liberty, one thing we learned on Wednesday is do it in the form of a gratuity, not in the form of a bribe. Okay, so all gratuity has to happen after the fact, and then if you're a billionaire, you will win. Just want to let people know what the law is now on buying a court. I don't want to say goodbye until we talk about EMTALA. We talked about it briefly on Wednesday when the quote unquote draft was quote unquote on the website, and quote unquote we had to wait and see in due course what was going to happen. And now we have it, and it's not much change, but I want to talk about it if we can. And I'll start with you, Lisa. This too, in the end, is a deregulatory opinion. This too is of a piece with all those cases we listed at the top of the show that is an attempt to make it impossible for Congress to do its job and for agencies to do their job. And while it is, and I think we made this point when we talked about it Wednesday, Mark, a case that looks like a punt. It's not actually a punt. It's a devastating blow if you're in the Fifth Circuit or in any one of the states that has far-reaching abortion prohibitions that are much, much, much worse than EMTALA would allow for. This doesn't solve a lot of problems. And as I said earlier, it's also very emotional if you're Amy Coney Barrett, I guess. But would you talk, Lisa, briefly about this as another blow to the administrative state?
Yeah, it's not obvious, but it's really important. EMTALA is a federal statute. It is policed by an administrative agency. It has to do with funding. That's the way it works, is by withdrawing funding for hospitals for Medicare if they don't treat emergencies. And so it is definitely right in the wheelhouse of what we've been talking about. Federal statute administered by an administrative agency. That agency has had the same position on this statute for decades. That agency has made it clear to the court what its view of the statute is. And so without saying a word about those facts, this case fits very well with the larger theme about weakening federal power to protect people.
Mark, do you have any kind of cherry on top of the icing, on top of the Jenga, on top of the rug thoughts on EMTALA as a case that is not just an abortion case, the way we tend to classify it in the press, but very much a case about not being able to help people who need to have their lives made better in emergencies?
Yeah, I mean, Lisa's observation is so astute, I'm not sure I can add to it. I guess I'll just point toward the opinions in the EMTALA decision by Justice Kagan and Justice Jackson, where they say, hey, guys, you know that Congress passed this law for a reason, right? And the reason was to create this federal baseline standard of care for patients in medical distress. And literally all that the Biden administration is trying to do here is vindicate that right that Congress created. Why is this such a hard case for us? And I think that's a great rhetorical question. Like the majority, if it had a real answer, it would be politics and aversion to abortion and disregard for women's health. But instead, it has to dance around with these abstractions about the spending clause and whether there's really a conflict between these two statutes. It seems that the very last thing that this conservative supermajority ever wants to do is acknowledge that Congress can create rights that the federal government can enforce. And I think that just points toward this great line in Sotomayor's dissent from the Jarkesy case, where she says, and I'll quote, "Once again, the majority arrogates Congress's policymaking role to itself. It prescribes artificial constraints on what modern-day adaptable governance must look like. Its decision offends the framers' constitutional design so critical to the preservation of individual liberty, the division of our government into three coordinate branches to avoid the concentration of power. Judicial aggrandizement is as pernicious to the separation of powers as any aggrandizing action from either of the political branches. Put simply, the Supreme Court itself is gobbling up power reserved to the other branches, and in doing so, violating the Constitution itself. This marks the second time in 2 terms that the liberal dissenters have accused the conservatives of violating the Constitution. Last term, Kagan did it in the student debt case. They are saying this court will not allow Congress to act to address modern problems and will not allow the executive branch to enforce Congress's guarantees. And if that is not a huge alarm for everyone who thinks we should have a government by the people and for the people, rather than a juristocracy of insulated judges with billionaire friends who think that the most important intrusion on liberty is the SEC imposing a fairly modest penalty on a scam artist, I just don't know what else I can say to convince them.
Lisa Heinzerling is the Justice William J. Brennan Jr. Professor of Law at the Georgetown University Law Center, and she is a former senior Obama EPA official whose primary specialties are environmental and administrative law. Mark Joseph Stern covers the Supreme Court, the courts, the law, democracy, and Jenga for us here at Slate. And in case any of the justices are thinking about maybe letting this endless term come to an end on Monday, I just want to note that given that Harlan Crow may be willing to pay your med school tuition, Justice Alito, so that you can go to med school and tell us when women, in fact, do need emergency abortions in Ohio and elsewhere, let's get this term over so you can go to med school as you always dreamed. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you.
Thanks.
We are for sure going to come back to EMTALA, of course. We're going to have more in our big end-of-term wrap-up episode that we're going to bring to you whenever it is that this term wraps up. Also, over on our sister podcast, What Next with Mary Harris, which happens here at Slate, all of next week, they are going to be digging into some of the personal stories behind these cases. You can find What Next wherever you listen to your podcasts. And that is a wrap for this bonus Opinionpalooza episode of Amicus. Thank you so much for listening in, and thank you so much for your letters and your questions. You can keep in touch at amicus@slate.com, and you can find us at facebook.com/Amicus Podcast. Sarah Birmingham is Amicus's senior producer, with an assist today from Ben Richmond, who is our senior director of podcast operations. Thank you, Ben. Alicia Montgomery is vice president of audio at Slate, and Susan Matthews is Slate's executive editor. We'll be back with another episode of Amicus on Saturday. And until then, let us all try to hang on in there.